That's it. Thank you.
ولن نصمت.
Oh, yes. So my T-shirt says "Lan nasmut," which is "We will not be silent." This is actually not from Egypt. It actually started from the U.S. from discrimination. We will not be silent to discrimination against Arab Americans. We will not be silent against discrimination, even in our own country, in Egypt, against Christians or against any minority.
شكرا نادين وهاب. وأعطي الكلمة الآن لمنى تحاوي دائما من مصر. المقيمة منى تحاوي مقيمة في نيويورك وهي صحفية عفوا وكاتبة مصرية. تفضل.
How do I turn this on? Hello? Okay.
It's okay.
Shukran Sana, thank you. I'm going to speak in English as well. I will speak more about media, international media, and also women. And I'll try to combine the two. Because I live in New York and I'm able to follow what most mainstream media there have reported on the Middle East, I've been in the United States since 2000, I've given up on US media especially and its ability to cover the Middle East in a way that I feel is adequate. This became very clear to many people in the United States very soon after the attacks of September the 11th of 2001, and it became even clearer when the United States invaded Iraq. And with those two events, you had a lot of Americans who became very disillusioned with the kind of media they were getting, especially seeing images of US journalists standing on tanks who were embedded with various US news outlets and who were using language like "we." You know, when a journalist is covering a war and he or she is using language like "we," it sounds more like state-controlled media than the independent media that the US media supposedly are supposed to be. So what you saw happening in 2001 and even more so in 2003 was a moving away from mainstream media and looking for alternative sources of information. In 2001, it was more turning towards European, or British rather, because they needed English, sources of information. So you had a lot of Americans who discovered The Guardian, you had a lot of Americans who discovered the BBC Online as a way of countering the kind of coverage that they did not like on Muslim issues, discrimination against Muslims, and any kind of real substantive discussion on quote-unquote terrorism, Al-Qaeda, etc. With 2003, there were alternatives that weren't just mainstream media via Europe, but online. And one of the most is actually connected to the T-shirt that Nadine is wearing was worn by an Iraqi-American activist called Raed Jarrar. Is he American too? Or just Iraqi? I think he's just Iraqi. Anyway, Raed was one of several Iraqi bloggers who were blogging around the time of the 2003 invasion of Iraq, who themselves became alternative sources of information. But the one that interests me the most, and the one that I often use as an example of bringing together both social media's ability to counter narratives in mainstream media and also to give voices to the most marginalized. Because I think one of the most effective ways, and my fellow panelists have all touched on this, is that social media created or helped activists, especially the most marginalized, to create online, in the virtual world, a world that didn't exist in the so-called real world. And then they were able to take it back into the real world and effect change on the ground, as many have already pointed out. So the blogger that I usually like to point to and that I teach when I give courses on social media is a young woman who used the name Riverbend. She was an Iraqi woman whose name we do not know to this day, and her family eventually fled to Syria as refugees. Now, I don't know if they're still in Syria because I don't know what the situation for them would be in Syria today. But anyway, from 2003 to 2007, she maintained a blog that was called Baghdad Burning, that became one of the most popular blogs where, in English, she was able to basically watch CNN or the BBC or any other media and then go to her blog and tell you what it was like as an Iraqi on the ground, experiencing shock and awe, experiencing George Bush's so-called, we will liberate them from God knows all kinds of things, democracy at the end of invasion, etc., etc. And by doing so, she was able to create a narrative that Americans were not hearing on their mainstream media. So when I teach her blog now has been collected in 2 books. She's received many awards. When I assign the book form or even the online form of her blog to American students who in 2003 were around the age of 13 or 14 and now are in their early 20s. It is such a shock to their system to experience the other story. People who were experiencing it as adults at the time found it a very useful source of countering whatever narrative they were hearing and creating a two-way flow of information. So she was getting emails from people across the world. She would get thousands of emails or comments on her blog. But for my students, who at the time weren't accessing her email, what reading her blog in just, as soon as as recently as just last year, what it did to them was it reminded them that mainstream media do not control all the narratives anymore. And again, this is something you will hear again and again from my fellow panelists. When you take that and you remember what happened around, especially in North American media, the time of the beginning of the Tunisian Revolution, you then understand how in 2003 Riverbend was doing this, and in 2010, and all throughout our various revolutions, the various activists who are using social media continue to do it. Because in the United States and in Canada, nobody was paying attention to Tunisia. First of all, North America doesn't pay any attention to Tunisia in the way that Europe does, because it is not a former colony, it's not a place where they go on vacation. Very few people even know where Tunisia is. And the Tunisian Revolution, with Bouazizi's self-immolation, began during the holiday season. So we had Christmas, we had Hanukkah, the Jewish festival, we had the New Year celebrations. So nobody was paying any attention. And even the established mainstream media, such as the New York Times, they arrived on the scene extremely late. 5 days or 6 days before Ben Ali was forced to step down. So from that moment on, before that even, I was getting all my information on what was happening in Tunisia through activists who were using Twitter, through activists who had put together collectives as news forums like Nawat, like Tunisian Girl. Lena was supposed to be here, but unfortunately she's not here. Lena, who was the woman behind the Tunisian Girl blog, became such a vital source of information because, like Riverbend, she was going out there and reporting the news from a Tunisian perspective, from a Tunisian female perspective. Because remember, during wartime, during revolution, during social upheaval, there is a hierarchy of voices, and usually at the bottom of that hierarchy are women's voices. So I like to focus on those who are out there, who are marginalized, yes, but even within the most marginalized groups, there are marginalized groups. There is a hierarchy of marginalization. Obviously, it depends on which country you're talking about, but generally, and for me as a feminist, it's women's voices that I want to get out there the most, and it's women's voices that are often completely ignored in mainstream media. If you pick up the New York Times or the Washington Post, they rarely speak to women. They always speak to old white men. And when they speak to non-whites, it is to old brown or black or any other kind of ethnic background. They never speak to women. It's as if women in the Middle East and North Africa do not exist. And here we are on one of those rare panels where the majority of us are women. So thank you to the organizers for putting so many women. Now you guys know how it feels. And I don't want all women panels, and I don't want women to dominate panels. I want panels to reflect all the voices that we have in our respective communities, in our respective societies, because that is what the revolutions are about. The revolutions have challenged the patriarch, who for the longest time claimed to speak for all of us. The revolutions, as Osama mentioned and Nassim mentioned, have challenged mainstream media narratives. And I'm very glad that Nassim mentioned the mainstream media narrative of how it was always considered, because the Washington Post, the New York Times, all those other newspapers would always go to the same experts who would always tell them the only change will come from the Islamists. And we from the region knew that there were many more people on the ground, not just the Islamists. So to always go for that same stereotype was detrimental to everybody, to the readership and the public in North America, who was getting a very diluted version of what was happening, but it was also very unfair to the people on the ground in the Middle East and North Africa, who very courageously stood up to the patriarch and to those trying to control their voices. And now, when you follow mainstream media and you see how women in Saudi Arabia, one of the most patriarchal and conservative societies, are able to use Twitter and other social media, like posting videos on YouTube of themselves driving, that ability to challenge patriarchies of various kinds, that ability to challenge narratives of various kinds, that is how the revolution begins. And that's why social media and its platform that it gives to the marginalized voices is something that is extremely inspiring. It needs a revolution on the ground. there's no such thing as a Twitter revolution. Twitter is a tool, Facebook is a tool. But what we use these virtual tools for doing is to create a space that then is reflected back in the real world that then creates an even greater space. Thank you.
شكرا منى. وأعتقد أن أسامة منجد ونسيم ترونهم من سيطالبون الآن بالمناصفة وبالتمييز الإيجابي لصالح العنصر الرجالي. الكلمة الآن لماريان سرينات وهي الأمينة العامة للرابطة العالمية للمشاركة المواطنة. الكلمة لك.
Thank you. First of all, let me just say how privileged I feel to be on this panel. I mean, as the only sort of middle-aged person here, as the only person that hasn't played a role in toppling any governments recently, as the only person that is, you know, on the first panel that I've seen that actually has a majority of women, I just feel very privileged to be part of this panel. So thank you very much. You've heard all the arguments, right? The contestations around what was the specific trigger, what was the specific role that this technology or that medium played in which revolution. That's a debate I think we're never going to fully finish because, as we know, success has many fathers and failure is an orphan. So as soon as you've got success, everybody's going to claim that they played some part in that success being achieved. But I think there are some bigger changes that underlie these facts on the ground that we need to focus on. I think change number one is not just in this region, but around the world, ever larger numbers of people have come to the realization that the real root cause of the many different problems and crises that we deal with is, in fact, whether that problem might be climate change or that problem might be poverty, unemployment, inequality, corruption, accountability, whatever you want to call it. I think one of the things that's changed in 2011 is that large numbers of people on the ground now understand that the root cause of all these problems is actually the fact that our governments have been subjected to hostile takeovers by private interests. I'm going to say that again. Our real problem is that governance has been subjected to hostile takeovers by private interests. Those private interests are sometimes business, sometimes military, sometimes religious, sometimes gosh-awful combinations of those three. But that realization that we have a shared cause, I think, is the bigger outcome, in a sense, of the social media revolutions that we're talking about. Consequently, and it's not surprising, we've seen a complete loss of faith, or at least a serious erosion of faith, in all institutions. Institutions of government, institutions of business, the old established media, and, to be fair, the old established civil society. Because one of the reasons people are on the street is because traditional civil society failed them, or traditional civil society was not allowed to play its role for them. There's an organization called Edelman, and they do an annual assessment of trust around the world. And in all 50 countries that they surveyed last year, business is now the bottom of the pile in terms of the least trusted entity. Then comes governments, then comes media, and civil society is the most trusted entity around the world. This includes China. This is how radical the change is. The third thing that I want to talk about as an impact of this thing is, right from the so-called global war on terror, governments around the world, north and south, democratic and autocratic, used those incidents as excuses to constrain, muzzle, stifle democratic dissent, civil society, freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom of assembly around the world. And in many ways, in so doing, they almost forced people to take to the streets, to take to Facebook, to take to Twitter, because they stifled every legitimate form of dissent. And you're seeing this even today. I mean, you look at what, there have been 400 arrests yesterday in the US of demonstrators in the country that calls itself this great champion of democracy that was going to show us all how to be more democratic. So at Civicus, for example, we track countries that are passing laws that have the effect of constraining civil society. And over the period 2009-2010, there were 90 countries 90. This is not just a few rogue regimes in the Middle East or in East Asia or in Africa. 90 countries passed laws or changed policies that had the effect of stifling freedom. The fourth factor, I think, that played a role in the revolutions is the fact, is what some of the panelists before me have talked about. The hard graft, day-to-day work of building those networks, those alliances, the shared understanding, the shared analysis of the problem, the shared vision of the future. And whether the technologies in that sense were the icing on the cake. They were a catalyst, they were an amplifier, they allowed for scale to happen at a pace that it could not have happened before. It allowed controls to be bypassed, and it allowed mobilization to happen globally rather than simply be limited to a neighborhood, a town, a city. I think when you put those factors together in a sense, there's the geopolitical shift. Let's talk about that a little. I'm not sure that these revolutions would have happened if the U.S. was today the power that it was. And if these tyrannical regimes could count on the U.S. sending in the 7th Fleet just to sort of sit outside their harbors. We knew by Jan 2011 that the U.S. was no longer that power that was going to come to the defense of its friends in the region. So we put those factors together, and in my understanding, what you got was motive, means, and opportunity to allow the belief that change was possible. And that then allowed the challenge to leaders across the region. I want to say one or two more things. One is, this is not just a challenge to governments. This is as much a challenge to media, as Mona has pointed out. It's as much a challenge to business. It's as much a challenge to civil society. We are all of us, especially the more middle-aged ones among us, or the old white men, or the men in suits, are really going to have to rethink the way we run organizations, the way we run networks, the way we manage teams, all of that. Because there's a generation now that's not just empowered. They know that the words that were used by a Syrian activist at the Civicus Assembly in Montreal was, and he really summed it up for me, he says, we are no longer afraid. And that is what fundamentally changed. There were all these other factors in the soup, if you will, but that final garnish was the belief that change was possible and you no longer needed to be afraid. We're going to have to look at, starting now, starting 2011, it doesn't matter what you do, whether you run a foundation or whether you run a government, you're going to have to look at the agenda being set from the bottom up. You're going to have to subscribe to radical transparency, I mean, of the WikiLeaks kind, or that's the alternative. You're going to have to build a system that is based on consent, not based on control. And you're going to expect pushback, because already, I mean, today in the US Congress, they're debating a so-called something about Prevention of Piracy Act or something, which is a thinly veiled legislation that really has the effect of stifling internet freedoms. So we're living literally on the cusp of history. These people and their friends and their colleagues and you people in the room made it happen, for which I and I think the rest of civil society around the world are deeply grateful. Thank you.
شكرا للسيدة ماريان سيرينات. قبل أن نفتح النقاش مع القاعة، بعد المداخلات القيمة تظل بعض الأسئلة المعلقة اللي ربما لم نجيب عنها بعد. سأحاول أن ألخصها في 3 ديال النقاط. هل يمكن أن نعتبر جميع مطالب الشباب الآن عبر وسائل الإعلام الجديدة هل كلها مطالب مشروعة؟ لاحظنا في تونس، في مصر، في المغرب أحيانا بعد التحريف للمطالب التغيير، فهل كل مطالب الشباب اليوم مشروعة؟ سؤال ثاني، هل سيكتفي اليوم الشباب بالحرب ضد الدكتاتوريات وننسى حروبا أخرى كانت قد بدأت من قبل على الفيسبوك وعلى تويتر، مثل الحرب من أجل الدفاع عن مزيد من الحريات الفردية؟ كانت بدأت حركة كفاية في مصر، حركة أنا مش هتحجب وانت تأدب، حركة مالي في المغرب، مجموعة من الحركات التي لم نعد نسمع عنها اليوم، وأصبح كل الصراع اللي هو طبعا صراع مشروع، لكن هل سيعوض باقي الصراعات الأخرى؟ هل ستختفي باقي الصراعات الأخرى؟ وكنت قد شاهدت لافتة جميلة جدا رفعها الشباب في تونس تقول: قبل الثورة كل شيء ممنوع، بعد الثورة كل شيء حرام، هرمنا من أجل لا شيء. لافتة جميلة جدا ومعبرة وتطرح العديد من نقاط التساؤل. نقطة أخيرة ثالثة وأخيرة، ألم يلاحظ البعض أن بعض الحركات المنادية بالتغيير في العالم العربي عبرت بشكل أو بآخر عن بعض ضيق الخاطر؟ وأخذ على سبيل المثال عبارة بلطجية التي بدأت في مصر وتم استعمالها في مجموعة من البلدان العربية الأخرى، فحيث أصبح أن كل شخص غير متفق مع شكل من أشكال الاحتجاج أو شكل من أشكال التعبير يعتبر بلطجي. فهل من الضرورة أن يكون لدينا جميعا نفس الاتجاه؟ يعني حركات تغيير جاءت أساسا من أجل المطالبة بمزيد من الديمقراطية، بمزيد من هامش أو هوامش حرية التعبير، لتصبح في النهاية تطالب بتوجه فكري واحد ونمط فكري واحد. ربما هذه 3 أسئلة يمكن أن نرد عنها قبل أن نفتح القاعة. أترك الكلمة حرة لمن يريد التعليق على هذه الأسئلة. نسيم أو إلا عفوا أسامة.
يعني الحقيقة هو لا يمكن أن نستعمل مصطلح مشروعة، مطالب مشروعة. الجميع لديه الحق أن يعبر عن أي مطلب يريده، أما أن هي قابلة للتحقيق أم غير قابلة للتحقيق هذا سؤال آخر. أما الجميع طبعا الحق في أن يطرح ما يريد من أفكار ومن ضمن ضوابط القانون. طبعا القانون يضمن حرية الجميع لكن دون أن يعتدي على أحد. لكن إذا أنا أعلق على كلمة مشروعة، الجميع له الحق بأن يطرح ما يشاء وما يريد. لكن كأفهم سؤالك يبدو أنه كان هل جميع مطالب الشعب أو الشباب محقة أو قابلة للتحقيق؟ هذا سؤال آخر. قد لا تكون محقة لأنها قد تتجاوز نواحي قانونية، لها تعقيدات قانونية أو مالية أو دولية أو سياسية معينة، وهذا يجب أن يشرح ويجب أن يوضع ضمن الكوميونيكيشن استراتيجي لأي حكومة أو لأي كامبين. لكن أعود أقول الجميع له الحق أن يطرح ما يشاء وما يريد كيف ما يشاء وكيف ما أراد.
شكرا أسامة. وأعتقد أن السيدة مريان سيرينات عندها كذلك تعقيب.
Sorry, yes. I mean, obviously the revolutions are vulnerable to subversion, they're vulnerable to co-optation, they're vulnerable even to just short attention spans and people becoming cynical and saying, as you did a few years ago, saying, you know, the heck with this, this is not working, I'm going back to being whatever I was before. But I think that the key will be if the revolutions can defend the values that inspired them in the first place. And really, each group, each movement is going to have to find ways of, in a sense, policing itself, of constantly challenging itself to stay true to the values. One of the things that can help at this point is experiences from other countries, and other countries that have been through their own revolutionary transformations. Indonesia, South Africa, the Philippines. There are many countries that in the 90s and in the late 80s, not so long ago, have been through similar transitions and have seen in many cases their revolutions stolen from them. So there is huge merit at this point in time in connecting up with activists from those countries and sort of being given the pitfalls and the warnings and, you know, how to navigate these complex negotiations, constitution writing, negotiations with the World Bank, how to form how to build institutions. And traditional civil society organizations who may or may not have played a part in the revolutions can now play that bridging role of doing the much less sexy, much more boring work of drafting legislation, building institutions, because that's what they know how to do.
شكرا سيدة مريان سرينات. وأعتقد أن نادين وهاب لديها تعقيب.
One of the things that keeps coming up is, at least in Egypt, is that I hear a lot of my family say this. It's more anecdotal evidence, but you know, there's a limit to freedom, and you shouldn't curse. And as we recently know, there was a woman who posted as a political statement a nude picture of herself on a blog. That's just bad behavior. And my response is, bad behavior isn't illegal, okay? You may not want me to do this, but I will defend everyone's right to do this. And I think it's important for us to note that. The second thing that I did want to respond to is the appropriateness of the demands or how practical they are. Well, politics is the art of the practical. Revolution is making the impossible possible. And so if you combine this together, you have to see that politics, you're looking at your possibilities and then choosing one. I don't want those possibilities. I'm not playing politics. I'm playing revolution. In that sense, when I got an email from someone who said, "What about a Facebook government?" I first looked at it and said, "Really? I don't know." And then I thought, you know what? Crowdsourcing government. This is in practice when we're talking about open government in the US. This is in practice in San Francisco when the municipality started using open source technology like shoot, click, fix, which allows you to shoot a problem in your neighborhood, send it to a website, and then the government comes and fixes it. There are many, many, many possibilities out there. And having someone, having worked with people who are actually developing technologies to further engage, you have examples of Afghanistan using these technologies. You have examples, and you have the organizations on the ground that need this technology to expand and to become more engaged in government. So why not a Facebook government? That's a form of direct democracy. I know it sounds crazy to everyone. I know this is way beyond the thinking. But if you look at traditional government, if you're looking at representative government, I'm not saying voting. I'm saying holding your representative accountable. I'm saying telling them what your problem is and expecting them, like you said, absolute transparency, expecting them to respond and tell you why they're not fixing it within this week, expecting them to respond to your demands, whether it's local, it's I have عايزة أقول مجاري sewage. Having sewage on your street, or I don't have electricity, or the electricity is going out, or there's trash that needs to be picked up. This is what crowdsourcing government is. And then you can take that and expand it past it. Technology has made a lot of things possible, and we need to look past the paradigms we're stuck in right now and see what is possible. This is a revolutionary time, and we need to stop thinking of just politics.
شكرا نادين. سنكمل الجولة أعتقد قبل